If there's anything that can be difficult for players to understand, it's the concept of space and how to position yourself. But in reality, what it all boils down to is how you use these elements to swing fights in your favor. So today I have the #1 secret for you to win those fights, and that is how to control positioning and space. But if you want to improve faster and get more in-depth guides on how to position, make sure to head over to the GameLeap website, where I personally have made literally hundreds of guides to help you learn more effectively. Guides covering fundamentals, advanced movement techniques, advanced legend tutorials, gameplay breakdowns, legend abilities, legend strategies, and so much more. So if you actually want to improve quickly and become insane at the game, I highly recommend you join the GameLeap family to get instant access to all of these in-depth guides by checking out the link in the description below. Now, the very first thing you need to understand if you want to have better control over fights and have better positioning is space. Space is exactly what it sounds like: the area surrounding or between you, an enemy, and most importantly, the geometry throughout the map. And if you don't know what I mean by geometry, I'm just referring to any walls or objects in the game that can be used as cover. This can be anything from boxes and building walls to trees and rocks. Now, when it comes to space, there are basically 3 types: X-axis, Y-axis, and Z-axis. Don't worry, I'll explain. And essentially, X-axis space is the open area extended out to your left and right. Y-axis is any open area going forwards or backwards between you and the enemy. And Z-axis space is vertical, such as high ground, for example. To keep things simple, I won't use the axis terms too much, and we'll stick to forward, backward, right, left, and up for now. Now, in general, this space is obviously occupied by us, the player, and these objects or geometry, and when space is occupied, it offers control. Usually the more space that is occupied, the more control that you'll have. If you have one player behind a pole and another behind a shipping container, who is more likely to win? It's the player behind the shipping container. This is because of the inherent object taking up more space and allowing that player to have that dynamic control over the fight. A large part of this is due to predictability. The guy behind the pole is very easy to see and get an angle on, and they also will be immediately exposed anytime they move, while the guy behind the big container is going to be much harder to predict. And also, if the player behind the pole tries to get an angle, they will be forced to move farther away from the safety of their pole to do so, in turn putting them in much greater danger. When you move away from objects, you lose the amount of space you occupy, therefore losing more control of the fight. This is the main concept for left to right space and comes heavily into mid-range combat. Now, for forward space, there is a very big push and pull dynamic to it. You need to create pressure on enemies, and the more you are able to create openings for you to push up and maintain that pressure, the more likely the enemy player is to make a mistake. This is what's called taking space. Essentially, you are taking control over the fight by pushing forward, giving the enemy players less options. If they react and make the wrong choice, it becomes easier for you to win, plain and simple. This is why high-level players are always so aggressive, because they know taking space and creating pressure is the key to forcing enemies to make those mistakes. Think about it. If you crack an enemy and don't push, what is the enemy going to do? They're going to heal and reset the fight, and at that point, they can pretty much continue on like nothing ever happened. But if you take space from them while they are trying to recover, now they have to quickly react. This is why aggressive pressure causes enemies to make mistakes. However, it's also important that you remember when there is forward space, or when you're trying to take space, there is also backward, aka creating space. And this is where the positioning game sort of turns into a dance. Let's say, for example, you do decide to push on that enemy you cracked. However, that enemy already knew you were going to push and fell back to another piece of cover ahead of time, creating more space between you and them, or at the very least, maintaining the amount of space there was previously. In other words, maintaining control. This allows them to have more time for decision making, and if they play their cards right, they can even use this to punish you for trying to take that space, because if they make it farther back to another piece of cover before you are able to close the distance and you are still in the open, they easily can peek from their new angle, beam the crap out of you, and there's nothing you can do about it. In that moment, you will be the one with limited options and forced to react, making it a higher chance for you to be the one making mistakes. And this is why timing can be so critical, and why I say this becomes like a push and pull dynamic or dance. The player who is better able to use space to their advantage with good timing is going to win regardless if they are aware of themselves doing it or not. But this is also why having a good understanding of this is going to put you miles ahead of the game. People don't really actually think about this. You will be able to see the dance happening and know when when to fall back, push forward, and how to make it so the decisions come easily ahead of time. Also, I should point out that you can use your left and right to create space, but keep in mind that this does not create nearly as much space as pulling directly backwards, but sometimes you won't have a choice, and sometimes it will be a better option. This is just going to depend on way too many factors to explain here, but just understand that you need to start learning to not only take space, but create space at the right times if you want to win more fights. Alright, now let's talk about the Z-axis or vertical space. And yes, of course, I am referring to high ground. Now, if you haven't noticed yet, there is a very common theme with everything we've discussed so far, and that is the fact that having a visual on the enemy makes it easier to control the fight. This is the reason why high ground is so strong. Going up in axis literally changes the dimension of the fight, allowing you to nullify the horizontal plane of control to a degree. Not only that, but having high ground allows you to abuse a little mechanic we like to call head glitches, which basically allows you to cover your body and only expose your little Nagi poo, making it very difficult for them to hit you while you still have a complete visual on them and should have no problem landing your shots, unless you have terrible aim. Now you understand why high ground is so crucial and can often be the defining factor to your wins or losses. It is the most powerful out of all the axes of space and should not be underestimated on how much control it can provide you and your team. But of course, it isn't always going to be 100% perfect, as usually being on top of the high ground can expose you to third parties or to players who create a lot of left to right space, who will then use that space to achieve equal footing as you without you even realizing it. Once they have a clear equal footing on a horizontal plane as you, then you are going to be in trouble. This is because they will likely have a complete visual, and as I said, usually when you're on the high ground there's not too much cover to work with because you're usually using the base for your cover to get those head glitches. But once someone is on equal footing as you, that gets taken away. So this can very quickly flip on you if you're not careful. Now there's one more common theme here you may or may not have noticed, and that's the fact that the players who are more proactive than reactive have a much higher chance for success and are going to be the ones creating massive amounts of pressure on enemies. For example, the player who created space to get on equal footing as the high ground player just now forces the high ground player to react, making them lose their high ground and even cause them to land on even lower ground than their enemies were at, or into a position with far less control. Or our player on the forward space pushed into the open only to get beamed by the player who already fell back to new cover. When you play proactively, you are the one who controls the fight, plain and simple. And proactive doesn't just mean W key until you die. No, proactive means you need to understand the flow of the fight and make your move before the enemy is able to. Always remember, the key is to be the actor, not the reactor. In the end, dynamic of fights is heavily weighed on how you or your enemy abuses the space and geometry around you. This is the reason why positioning and game sense are the most important thing, not only in Apex, but in most FPS games. This is the reason why wall hack legends are so potent, because they allow players to stay one step ahead, even when they theoretically shouldn't be. So if there is anything I would tell you to do, it's to take the time to master the skill of controlling space. Control space, and you will control your win rate. This has been Johnny. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.